Welcome to the Sacred Art of Joking. I'm James Carey, BBC sitcom writer and author of a book called The Sacred Art of Joking, and it is my belief that the Bible is much funnier than it first appears. In fact, if you're not finding any of the Bible funny, you're not taking it seriously. In this series, I'm speaking to a number of folk who are Bible fans and comedy fans, and to find out which bits of the Bible make them laugh out loud. And my guest this time is the director of the Solas Centre for Public Christianity and author of a new book called Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? I can hear audiences might be worried before we've even started. Andy Bannister, welcome. Hello, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well, James. Really good to be on the show. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. I'm good. Now, we're on a fast track to cancellation, aren't we, with Muslims and Christians? But we're going to talk about the Bible first. So, we'll go out in a blaze of glory. Tell us a bit about the part of the Bible you want to talk about that makes you laugh.
Well, it's actually a part of the Bible that I discussed in the last chapter of the book, funnily enough, and it's Luke 15. And the funny thing is, straight away is one of the things I find interesting about Luke 15, James, is we often think about the three parables there: the sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. If Jesus is talking to Brits, there'd be the lost cause. Yeah. But those three things. Yeah. And we often think of them as three separate parables. Of course, Jesus intended them to be one, which is why Luke says Jesus told this story. And I think there's a lot of gospel in there, a lot of amazing stuff in there, and a lot of humour. Because Jesus drew audiences. I think he was a compelling speaker, and there's a lot of great stuff in here. So I love it as an evangelist. I love it as a comedian. I love it as a Bible scholar. So much in this passage. So Luke 15 is where we're going to go today.
So Luke 15 is the beginning of these three parables. Do you want to just quickly summarise them for us? I'm sure lots of our Christian viewers will be very familiar with them, but others maybe not so. Just give us the headlines of these parables and who is Jesus telling them to?
That's crucial, James, because Jesus is addressing a situation right at the top of Luke 15 where we hear there are two audiences. We hear there's the tax collectors and the quote-unquote sinners kind of gathering around to hear Jesus. And Jesus drew these kind of people in. The people who the other religious leaders would want nothing to do with were drawn to Jesus. And he was always getting in trouble for hanging out with the wrong crowd. So they're hanging around. And then we have the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, the religious elites, the kind of Archbishop of Canterbury's of their day. They all hang. I'm not saying anything wrong with the Archbishop, by the way, but the kind of religious elites. And the religious elites take a look at the others and go, oh man, Jesus, he calls himself a famous rabbi. Does he know who he's hanging out with? He's like eating. He's not just hanging out with, he is eating with tax collectors and sinners, and it's terrible. And to deal with that accusation that he's spending his time with the wrong crowd, Jesus tells them a story. And it's a three-part story. The first part is the kind of story of the lost sheep, and it's a story of a chap who has 100 sheep and loses one of them out in the wilderness, and goes out to find it and rescues it and brings it back, and then calls a great party at the end.
Yeah, let's just talk about that, because It's only after years and years and years where you suddenly realise that there's a line in there which is actually funny, because you've just it's not occurred to you that it's funny, is when he basically says, which of you having 99 sheep, you'd go off and look for the lost sheep, wouldn't you? And you're like, no. Would you go and leave 99 sheep? Is that right, do you think?
I think there's two things actually going on, James. There's that aspect. So Jesus says, which of you having 100 sheep and losing one would not leave the 99 to go and look for the one? And I think there is a degree to which there is part of the audience going, well, no, because I definitely got 99. Yeah. And I haven't got one. So why would I leave those to get those? And
99 sheep in the hand is not worth one about to fall off a cliff. That's like... No, exactly. It's not a catchy slogan, is it?
No, it's got to be a really bad joke about YouTube as well. But,
oh, very good.
And
okay.
Thank you. See what I did there? And so I think there is definitely Jesus making a point about the extravagance of God. That God isn't content to go, well, I got the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, so the other lot they could go burn. So I think Jesus is playing with that. But the other thing that I only saw recently when reading a commentary on this is actually anyone who's got 100 sheep in that context is pretty wealthy. So they're not going to be looking after the sheep themselves. They're not going to be rescuing the sheep themselves. They're going to hire somebody. They're going to hire a shepherd or a kind of hired hand whose job is going to be to manage the sheep. And anybody who is wealthy enough to have 100 sheep is going to be sitting by the fire, their feet up, a nice glass of wine, watching the first century equivalent of the news or whatever, or a movie or so forth. And so Jesus again playing with the crowd there, going, again, perhaps the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, they consider themselves almost too important to be out looking for the lost. And Jesus is doing a contrast. He's saying, well, I'm like the guy who has risked leaving the 99 safe ones because I want to rescue everybody, and I am not so self-important. I'm not such a famous rabbi. I am beyond getting down and getting out there and getting my hands dirty. And of course, rescuing a sheep. In point out, rescuing a sheep is not an easy thing. You know, you lose a dog, you find it, you whistle, the doggy comes home. You know, but the sheep, firstly, sheep get themselves lost quite regularly, and sheep don't follow you home. That shepherd is going to have to go to pick that darn thing up, put it on his shoulders, and carry it back. There is a cost involved.
Yeah, it's kind of
Jesus saying, I'm willing to pay that.
It's kind of humiliating, isn't it? Almost to go after your sheep in that sense. Again, not only would the owner not be the shepherd necessarily, but then to go after the one, and then yeah, you're right. My parents used to keep sheep for a while, and they sort of packed it in the end because the sheep just keep finding ways of dying. They're really hard to keep alive, and so yeah, it is kind of humiliating, isn't it? And that's a little bit of a theme, isn't there? I mean, that sort of comes up again in the parable of the lost son, or the father and two sons, or however you want to slice that.
Yeah, we'll come to that. And of course, the other thing as well that I think is going on here, again, is of course we forget in today's context, but back then, being a shepherd was not necessarily considered a particularly high class job. I mean, it's not today, but it's not considered disreputable. Back then, it was considered disreputable. Shepherds were people who many others considered with suspicion. You know, there was the kind of sort of slightly itinerant lifestyle. There's some of the things that shepherds, you know, were sort of rumoured to sort of get up to. They were considered immoral and a bit sort of outside the pale. And that Jesus is willing to identify himself with the shepherd is interesting. And again, I think there's this contrast that Jesus is constantly coming back to. The Pharisees, the teachers of the law, they set themselves apart, and they love, you know, wandering around dressed in important clothes, having people go, oh wow, there goes a famous person. Jesus is like, I'm not up for that. I am quite content to get down with the lost. You know, Jesus, again, not worried about reputation. He doesn't care, I think, that he had this reputation for hanging out with the wrong people. I think that's an important message today, because I meet many people, James, who I think they're too bad for God. And I think it's important to know that in Jesus, we have a God who's willing to get his hands dirty, who isn't embarrassed. However bad we think we are, we ain't too bad for God. Yeah. He's seen it all before. He's not surprised, and he's not worried about getting his hands dirty.
I should point out to viewers that Andy is also an evangelist, and that's why it's always going to end up having this. Through. Yeah, so do please bear with us, because that's how it lands. We're going to find out a bit about how that's going to land in that particular book shortly, but let's just get on to the meat of it. I know we've just spoken about rescuing sheep, but the meat of the father and the two sons. What is it? I mean, there's quite a few funny moments. I mean, I find. I mean, there are jaw-dropping funny moments, as in...
Yes, there are, aren't there?
I cannot believe he's just said that. Father, share your inheritance with me. Why don't you just quickly summarise the parable and then just say which bits of it you particularly think are funny?
So right at the start, of course, is this parable is often misconstrued. It's often known as the parable of the lost son, the parable of the prodigal son. In fact, my Bible, I'm looking at in front of me, my Northern Irish version, my NIV, says the parable of the lost son. And it isn't, though. It's the story of a father who has two sons. And as you say, the younger son comes to his dad and goes, Dad, I want my share of the inheritance now. In other words, Dad, I wish you were dead, because quite frankly, you being alive is inconvenient. I want the cash. Can I have it now? And his father, rather than, beat some sense into his son, which is what the listeners would have expected in the first century context, the father divides his money between them. So the older son gets his share as well as the younger son gets his share. Then, younger son goes off into a far country, burns through all of that money in wild living, ends up destitute, ends up taking the only job he can find because there's a famine has struck the country, and that's feeding pigs. And remember, this family is Jewish, and so pigs are considered unclean, and hits absolute rock bottom, and so decides, there in the pigsty, that he'll go back to dear old dad and give this carefully crafted little speech, all designed to get himself a job and get himself back into the family good books, and goes back to his dad. But before he can give his carefully crafted little speech, the dad has run to meet him on the road, hugged him, embraced him, clothed him in the best robe, put sandals on his feet, a ring on his finger, killed the fatted calf, thrown a barbecue to which the whole town is invited, and reconciled with his son. But while that's going on, the older son, the more responsible one theoretically, outside on the field, gets wind of the fact that younger brother has come back, throws an absolute mad hissy fit, and refuses to come into the house because, like, Dad, how could you forgive my younger son? He's a nightmare. And then gives this, speech to his dad. He's equally rude to his father, actually, about how all these years I've slaved for you and worked away and done all this kind of stuff, and you've never given me so much as a goat that I could celebrate with my friends. And the father ends up giving this beautiful speech to him out in the field, saying, son, everything you have is mine, but we had to celebrate because this younger brother of yours was lost and is found, was dead and is alive again. And then Jesus leaves the story hanging there. We don't find out
it's
how
kind
the
of
older
like
brother responds.
Pull back, this is you can imagine them cinematically, two people in a field near a barn, and it kind of like the drone shot going away to say what happens next.
You me have a cinematographic mind, because I often see the parables this way. I can close my eyes and think. I haven't done film like you have, but I love that medium, and I often find myself thinking, if I was filming that, that's the camera angle, that's the way that would work.
And I think that's interesting because it's one of the things that I argue in my book. I talk about how we just flatten everything out and just read it from scripture, and it's extremely dry and often very poorly read, especially in church. And as you're just describing that story, this is a rare parable in the sense that the characters really come through. I mean, they are funny sitcom characters, and you can imagine the younger son. There is a kind of sitcom character that is unbelievably sociopathic, and they just don't really fully understand, and they're just like, "Yeah, Dad, I need half the money now, so, could you get me the money?" It's just like, you're basically wishing I was dead. Yeah, soz about that. You know what I mean? There's an element of like, wow, this you have no idea. But for someone who is as thoughtless as that is then left sort of wishing he was eating as well as the pigs he is tending. I mean, talk about, there couldn't be a more comic drop in someone's kind of, I mean, and you can imagine when this story is being told, because sort of historically, most people would have experienced these stories through their ears and not with their eyes.
Yeah.
Anyone who might have been having it read to them, you would hope would be hearing these characters come through. I mean, obviously we've managed to avoid all that in the last 100 years in our culture. And so we just sort of read it assuming that none of this could ever possibly be funny. But that character comes through really strong. And then the older brother standing outside having a proper pout. You know what I mean? He's having a right old toddler temper tantrum of, I'm not going in. No. And it's kind of embarrassing, isn't it? It's just...
Well, the funny thing is, isn't it? It's funny that you think about it in sitcom characters. I've never thought quite about doing that. I mean, a couple of things that strike me. You're right. It's to go the younger son. I mean, it's hilarious. So he wants his freedom, and ironically, he gets it. He gets total freedom, but freedom ends up in a pigsty, unable to do nothing. Yeah. And the other thing in terms of sitcom characters, I think, James, actually that point about him asking for his father's money is crucial, because sometimes we can view that younger son in two ways that are wrong. Firstly, we view him as a little bit of a Jack the Lad. He's a bit like, he's like, I suppose with sitcom characters, he's like Del Boy.
Yeah.
He's a bit of a wide boy, well-intentioned, but he wants a bit of freedom, but just pushes it too far. But he goes to his dad and basically says, Dad, I wish you were dead. We're not supposed to see him sympathetically, who actually is a bit of a monster.
Yeah,
actually, he's there's a whole ego thing and a pride and an arrogance and just so many things going on there. And then the other end of the scale, of course, in terms of sitcom characters, I like that kind of total, almost upper class, if this was cast in the UK, religiousness. And it's, I love older kind of sitcoms, actually. We love a lot of stuff from the 70s, 80s and 90s. So my wife and I just be working our way through The Good Life. And so if you know that classic sitcom, there's that Margot next door. Who's like totally posh and stuck up.
Yeah.
And then, of course, from the late 80s, early 90s, you've got Hyacinth Bouquet and Keeping Up Appearances, who everything has to look just the right way. And I think the older brother is a bit like that. It's like, I've done the right thing, I'm being seen to do that. So the Pharisees are like, I like that. And then there's other comic moments that we often miss. The other bit that I often think is the younger son is often held up as a model of repentance. He works out this speech, he goes back, he's sorry. But Jesus has some massive fun here, because that little speech that the younger son works out on the road home, where he plans to say, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. He's basically quoting Pharaoh in the Old Testament, sometime around the fifth or sixth plague, forget exactly where, Pharaoh goes to Moses and says, I've sinned against heaven and against you. In other words, please make it stop. I'll say whatever the right thing is, just make it stop. And he's more or less word for word quoting Pharaoh. And to go, no Jewish hearer would have gone, oh yeah, that's a model of repentance. Pharaoh was trying anything just to make it stop. And this is what the younger son's doing. He's basically going to his dad and going, Dad, I want a job. Because in his brain, he's burnt through half, well, actually a third of the family inheritance, because he'd have got a third, the older son would have got 2/3 in the culture. So the son has burnt through a third of the family money, and in his mind, if I could just get a job and I can pay Dad back, I can sort it myself. Right. But Jesus is making the point, you can't, Buster, because forgiveness by its very nature is free. And just like for us, as we accept God's offer of forgiveness in Christ, him an evangelist, right? There's no point us trying, hey, God, have you seen the things I've done, man? I've raised money for Oxfam. I've only sworn 3 times in the last month. I'm a good person. And God looks and goes, no, you don't get it, do you? It's
It's a classic sitcom scene, isn't it? Or a movie scene where someone realizes they're completely at the end of the road, and then that's when they start to pray, and they're like, there's an episode of Bottom where Richard is sort of going, hello, Lord, remember me, sort of, and it's that kind of really pathetic toadying. And honestly, if you help me out this one time, I'll be ever so good, and I'll go to church every Sunday. And also, could you do something really awful to my brother, Eddie? It's that kind of, whilst I've got your attention. But it's a very common sitcom scene of someone just like going, okay, I'm at the end of, I'm now going to talk to God, and I'm going to sort of do a deal. And we know watching it that there is no deal. You don't have to be a Christian to find that scene funny, because you just think that's not how it works. And there's that really funny moment though, isn't there, when he's got this speech worked out, and then he meets his dad, and he gets a few words into it before basically he's just completely drawn in. It's amazing, isn't it?
I love it, and I love the other thing as well there's a beautiful book. There's a wonderful writer on the parables that you and I were talking about just before we began recording the show, called Ken Bailey, who lived in the Middle East for 30 years, has written huge amounts on the parables, including some good stuff on this parable. And I footnote Ken in my book, and Ken points out that the prodigal son is the wrong title for this parable. Maybe we ought to really call it the father with 2 sons. But here's the thing: in many Arabic versions of the Bible, both now and historically, this story is known in the Middle East as the story of the running father. Because Ken points out, when he was preaching on this in the Middle East, he got struck by the fact that Middle Eastern audiences would laugh at the father running. And he stopped and said, what's funny? He said, well, the reason it's funny, he was told, is no Middle Eastern father runs. If you're the patriarch, if you're the father who runs the thing, then your job is to, well, there isn't a job. You sit under a nice shady olive tree and with a cool drink, and you bark the orders out, and other people do the running. And this family, they have lands, they have servants, they have fields and possessions. So they're not a poor family. They've clearly got income. So there's no way on God's green earth that this father is going to run. That he hasn't run for 30 years, probably, since he was a young man.
Yeah, hitching up his tunic in some way and just sort of...
That's exactly, hitching his tunic up to run, exposing his legs, which is deeply shameful in that culture. So he's making a laughing stock of himself.
Yeah.
And there's this amazing point at the heart of this story that the younger son has humiliated his father, not just privately, but publicly. Everybody in the community knows what's happened. The elder son is about to humiliate his father by having a screaming hissy fit outside the family farm when all the village are there at the calf roast. And then the father humiliates himself to reconcile himself with his younger son. And again, the evangelist to me, what a picture of the gospel, that God doesn't leave us where we are, but in the cross, Jesus humiliated himself in order to win us back to him, even after all that we've done to him with the way that we've treated God. And Bailey points out the Middle Eastern audiences find that incredibly funny. And so it's known as the story of the running father in many parts of the Middle East. Yeah, it's really interesting,
isn't it? Because we sort of think, oh no, it's not one son, there are 2 sons, it's the parable of the 2 sons. And then actually you then forget the father's role in this is astonishing, isn't it? It really is. So like, who is this parable about? Well, it's quite hard to say, really. And I think some of us, especially conservative evangelicals in us, like to go, I would like to know the precise meaning of this story, to which you kind of want to say, I don't think you know what a story is. So it's like, if you want flat statements, then go to the Beatitudes. We've got those too. But here, this story is it's just very troubling, isn't it? But here's the big question. Why on earth are you writing about this in a book about Christians and Muslims?
Well, there's a story, right? So to go in a nutshell, James, I've been interacting with Muslims for years. I'm rare as a Christian. My academic background, my PhD work was on the Quran, not the Bible. So I've been involved in discussions with Muslims for 20 years. I spend a lot of my time sharing my faith with Muslims, as well as those of all faiths, other faiths and none. And I kept running across this question in a number of contexts. I came across a lot of secular friends, I think, who think that, Muslims and Christians, they're, along with Jews, they're part of one big Abrahamic faith. I think many Muslims who sort of think that Islam is a sister religion to Judaism and Christianity, and if they, just get us to abandon this Jesus stuff, they can draw us home to, be good little monotheists. And so I thought, what, the question no one's talking about is who is God? Because when you say you believe in God, you need to put some flesh on the bones and say, what sort of God are we talking about? And so in a nutshell, that's what the book does. But at the end of the story, being an evangelist, I didn't just want to go, look, it's a different God. The concept of God in the Quran or the Bible is vastly different. Ta-da! And leave it there. I want people to come home to the God of the Bible. And so actually, I conclude that in the answer to this question is largely no, but for some slightly yes. I think if you ask the question, does the Quran describe the same God as the God of the Bible? No. But are some Muslims yearning for a God who is love, a God who they can know, a God who it's possible to know more about than just the fact he's distant and has a few things he wants you to do? Yes, and I think the Bible gives us that mandate in Acts 17, where Paul is in Athens, comes across the altar to the unknown God, and uses that as a preaching point. You guys Athenians are worshipping this God who's unknown. Let me reveal him to you. And then I use the parable of the prodigal son in the last chapter as a window into that, because I think the elder brother in that story responds in quite a Muslim way, actually. Well, here are the laws, and I've obeyed the laws, and if I obey the laws, then my father should respond a certain way. And, here's God, and here are the commandments, and if I obey enough of the commandments, God will give me the big thumbs up, and I should, get what I deserve. And I try to break that whole model. And so the prodigal son seemed like this very great way, actually, to then end the story in the book, rather than talking about Bannister's ideas, end exegeting a parable, telling the story in a very Middle Eastern way, and then ending on that invitation that, there's the Father's house, the door is open, the party's begun, the barbecue is lit, and the invitation is there for everyone. I say to my Muslim friends, come on home. Don't stand outside in the field grumbling about, well, hang on a minute, why does Jesus need to die for me? I've kept all these laws. I don't need a saviour. Come on home. Come on home to the God who died in the person of Jesus for my atheist friends and for my Muslim friends. And so it was a great place to end the story. In fact, Ken Bailey, who I mentioned earlier, has written this wonderful book, The Cross and the Prodigal, in which he, again, exegetes that story, especially for Muslim audiences. But it's a whole book, and so I tried to do a similar thing in a chapter. So my hope is Muslims who come across the book, it'll expose them at least to one parable of Jesus that I think is such a powerful one for them to hear.
Yeah. So, and not only can you possibly see that way of thinking in that older son, but that view of God, the Christian God, seems so different from the God that we are. For those of us less involved, the God of Islam is not. It doesn't sound like the God that we read about in this parable, does it? Does he?
No, and I think exactly. And I think earlier on in the book, I sort of just take a little look at the identity of the character of the God in the Bible, and say, look, the God of the Bible is a God who's relational, a God who can be known, a God who is love, a God who has suffered. The Bible goes into huge detail around those characteristics in both Old and New Testament, and the Quran is utterly different. And the funny thing is, there's bits of humour in there too, because I think one of the things I find both amazing but also funny, James, in a way, is that God doesn't need us. I mean, sometimes we get an overinflated sense of ourselves, like God somehow does us a favour by reaching out to us. I mean, when you consider this is the God who brought everything into existence, the God without whose sustaining power not a single atom would hold together. I mean, just the awesomeness of who God is when you reflect on it. And God could turn around to us and go, oh my word, like, look at the mess they've made. Stuff the lot of them. But he doesn't. He stoops down and enters in to creation and goes through all of that trouble and allows humanity to do what it does ultimately to Jesus on the cross. And there's that sense, there is a sort of sense of humour there that at any moment God could go, right, game over. But he doesn't. He's willing to go through all of that. Yes, because he loves us. But there's an amazing revelation of who God is. But there's also, I smile at times. There's lots of bits of irony in the Gospels where people don't understand who Jesus is. Like, when he's asleep in the boat and the storm and the disciples are getting hugely upset. Oh my God, I'm going to drown. And I think there's a little bit of humour there in the Gospels going, do you actually know who you've got in the back of the boat? And you're worried about a little bit of wave and a bit of wind. Yeah. And the Gospels do that a lot, actually, of going, humanity just doesn't fully understand what's going on there. And I think, but it doesn't do it to make fun of us. I think the Gospels do it to bring us perhaps to a recognition of who we are, but also to reveal to us what God thinks about us.
I think the Bible does do it to make fun of us a bit, because we are overinflated very, very quickly and easily. And I think, if I don't have a grand unified theory of comedy, and I'm not sure there is one, but in general I argue that incongruity is at the heart of an awful lot of comedy. And therefore, if you have the perfect God-man hanging around with 12 disciples, you're going to get comedy, because one of these people can do things that others can't. And so you just see these comic reactions from the disciples regularly. And you just think none of us would have done any different. In actual fact, they did pretty well, all things considered. So I think we do sort of fill ourselves with pomposity very quickly and easily, and we shout at God, don't you care? Or we shout at Jesus, don't you know what's going to happen? Or, there are lots of those moments where people go to Jesus. The road to Emmaus is one of my favourite ones, where they just say, what are you talking about? And their eyes are kept from recognising him, and they're like, how are you the only person who has not heard about what's been happening? And you can just imagine, we know. So the irony there is just really, really nicely played.
I think so. And I think, you're right about the fact that I think we do tend to have these pompous views of ourselves. And of course, comedy pricks pomposity. There's nothing like it. But, we all like that in comedy, where the person who's got this overinflated sense of themselves is taken down slightly. And also, of course, the other thing in comedy that works a lot is the kind of turning the tables idea. You think it's going one when it goes the other, without going into yet another passage of the Bible. But one of my favourite bits where that happens is that moment where Jesus is walking through the countryside, and Jesus turns to his disciples and says, "Who do the crowd say that I am?" And the disciples begin answering, and I think they're having some fun together. I think they're like, some think you're John the Baptist, think you're Elijah, and I like to imagine in my mind's eye Jesus egging them on, going, "Oh yeah, those crowds, it's funny." They're all wailing with laughter, and then Jesus suddenly turns the tables and goes, "Well, okay, lads, who do you say that I am?" And I love to imagine all the disciples at that point, just total silence, because Struth, what do we say? There's Thomas going, "Oh, I don't know, man, I'm doubting Thomas." Matthias going, I don't speak in the Gospels, man, don't ask me. And then finally Peter speaks up and goes, "Well, you're the Christ, you're the Son of God." But that table turning happens a lot.
I wonder if, again, we can't detect intonation. It's like Twitter, isn't it? It doesn't do tone. When Peter says, "You are the Christ," I do wonder if it's him going, "Who do you say I am?" You are the
Christ.
Yeah. There's an element of like, I'm just going to start saying the word to see if that's going to, because again, they consistently show, I guess, Matt, in that part in Mark's Gospel in particular, it's like that's the hinge where they sort of, all is revealed to some extent, and then we see what his Christhood actually means. Well, I hope you're enjoying this episode of The Sacred Art of Joking with Andy Bannister and me. If you're enjoying this conversation as it's going at the moment, you're going to absolutely love my new book, which is The Gospel According to a Sitcom Writer. There it is. It's going to be available towards the end of June. You can pre-order a copy from me. It'd be great if you could do that if you're in the UK, because then I actually make some money out of it that way, and you're supporting this YouTube channel as well. So that's The Gospel According to a Sitcom Writer. Loads of stuff about all the funny stuff in the Gospels and in Acts, and lots of other bits and pieces as well. And I think you'll really enjoy the read. Back to the show. But one other thing, just about the character of God, I think we've sort of established our own absurdities in that. And yet the thing, and again, this is probably something I'd imagine that your Muslim friends would have some real trouble getting their heads around, is not only are we shown to be rather absurd, but that God listens to us and he enters into dialogue with us. Not only does Jesus become man, but just talking earlier, you just reminded me of when God says to Moses after the golden calf incident, he just says, "Right, that's it. game over. I'm going to start again with you. I'm going to obliterate them. And Moses is like, seriously, no, seriously, it's fine. No, look, just, okay, let's just take a moment here. And the way in which prophets speak with God, it's just, I mean, it's just kind of blasphemous, isn't it? To an Islamic way of thinking. They would say the idea that God would even listen, would be able to speak to a person is absurd.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, incidentally, I think that golden calf episode is the contender for the funniest line, in my view, in the whole of Scripture, when Moses speaks to Aaron about what have you done, and Aaron goes, "Oh well, we took all this gold and we threw it to the fire, and out came this calf."
Yeah, like, right.
Yeah. I mean, that is the worst excuse ever in the history of excuse. But no, you're right, and it begins earlier, James. I mean, I talk about this a bit in the book, actually. One of the verses I talk about in the book that shows the difference between the God of the Bible and the God of the Quran is that they're in the Garden of Eden. So God's created Adam and Eve, and there in the Garden of Eden, God is walking and talking, it says in Genesis 3 verse 8 with Adam and Eve. And just get your head around that. The creator of the universe, he has stepped into his creation and he is walking and talking his creation. And the Quran borrows the story of Adam and Eve, retells it, but rips that piece out. God's not there doing that. But then when Adam and Eve sin and then realize what they've done, are in hiding from God. So they're hiding, they make fig leaves, clothes for themselves out of fig leaves, and then hide behind a bush when they hear God coming. There's that wonderful comic moment where God calls out, "Adam, where are you?" And again, we miss that, going, this is the God of the universe. He knows exactly which bush Adam is hiding behind. He could literally just speak the word and said bush would evaporate, leaving a shiveringly naked human being, in all of his mess and whatever. But God is willing, and I think he does it not just because he wants a joke or whatever. He does it because throughout the Bible, God seeks relationship with humanity. He doesn't just want obedience. He wants relationship. He's willing to condescend. And I absolutely think there must be times where God's like, if God had a head he could put in his hands, would be like, what on earth are they doing? Adam, a bush? Dude, are you serious?
Yeah.
But God plays along. Yeah. And then I think elsewhere, when you've got like the Moses and Aaron thing going on, and God tells Moses to go to Aaron, go to Pharaoh and tell him to set his people free, and Moses goes, I can't speak, and God's like, okay, let me give you a couple of miracles, let me give you Aaron to speak for you, dude. I'm the God of the universe. I could work this out, and so that God is continually willing.
Yeah,
I think it's because if he didn't, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, my forthcoming book called The Gospel According to a Sitcom Writer has stuff about that exact passage where a burning bush, Moses is talking to a burning bush, and the fact that Moses just keeps continually saying, no, I don't think I'm going to, go to Israel, you're my, deliver my people. No. And he just comes up with this sort of series of excuses, and it feels like, whatever Charlton Heston did with the Ten Commandments, I think that is kind of burned in our brain of making that a fundamentally serious moment. But it reads comically, if you read it honestly. It is really strange.
And the funny thing is, you mentioned that we just watched the Ten Commandments with my 5-year-old and my 8-year-old. We're trying to educate them in classic movies as well as the modern stuff. And they love the Ten Commandments. But Moses, I think, was too impressive. He's a great big booming voice and a great big beard. And quite a big beard, actually, if you're going near burning bushes, frankly. Yeah. But it's all a bit too impressive. Whereas I think one of the things I like about the Bible, James, is that the human characters are just so darn realistic. They are funny. They mess things up. They just try and pull the wool over God's eyes. They just say very natural things. And it often occurs to me that I think, if you were inventing the Bible, you would paint, if you were the Jewish people making the Old Testament up, you'd make Moses far more impressive.
Oh, yeah.
If you were the first Christians making the Gospels up. I mean, there's Peter, the rock on which God will build his church. And he's just seen all the stuff that he has. And he just messes it up time and time again. He denies Jesus. He's there at the fire in the courtyard, and he denies that he ever knew the guy, despite the fact it's blinkingly obvious. You're a Galilean in Jerusalem. Everyone knows who you are, buddy. Yeah. And the fact that the realism there, and I think the fact that humour, in a sense, validates for me the Bible in places, because everyday life is funny. Human beings were fallen and broken and messed up creatures in need of grace and forgiveness, and we're not these kind of sort of hyper religious types who get everything right. And I like the fact that there's a realistic edge to the Bible, and I think that's why the comedy is important.
And we see that in our own lives too. And we should probably wrap up, but just to ask you, you've been on Speaker's Corner, standing on step ladders, debating radical Muslims also on step ladders. And there must have been times, especially early on, when you just thought, is God joking? Is this why am I here? There seems to have been a terrible mistake. I mean, you must have had moments like that where you just thought, God is really messing with me.
Well, the funny thing is, the way you phrased that, James, like, radical Muslims on step ladders. That's a book title in there that I need to find. I need to find an excuse for. I was also reminded of that terrible joke. This is my step ladder. I never knew my rule ladder.
That's great. I've never heard that before. That's really good.
That might be Tim Vine. I can't remember.
Okay.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. So I can remember I was about 24, 25. Guy came to my church at a presentation on the work he was doing at Speaker's Corner, preaching on the streets of Muslims. We got talking afterwards, and I talk about this in the first chapter of the book. And afterwards, he said we got chatting, and he went, "Why don't you come to Speaker's Corner and see what we do?" And so I went up to Speaker's Corner to see what they did, and it turned out that Jay's definition of come and see what we do was getting a ladder next to him, because I met him at Marble Arch Tube Station. He had 2 step ladders. So I was like, "Why have you got 2?" He went, "One's for me, one's for you." "I've never preached on the street before," said I. "It's easy," said he. "Okay, I've never talked to Muslims before," I said. "Yeah, they're easy," he said. He was wrong on both those counts, because I got humiliated by the Muslims there, who were well practiced in taking down enthusiastic but naive Christians. But there was something about it that was compelling. And I went back and went back and went back, and with practice and prayer and fear and sweaty palms, got better. But I do look back on it and going, God, what were you doing? But God, I think, had a sense of humour. I like to think God dispatched Bannister to Speaker's Corner with a twinkle in his eye.
Yeah, this will be
actually,
good.
Since then,
God's saying, "I know what's going to happen, and even I can't wait to watch this."
The angels, says the angels, "Hey, get some popcorn for this.
You're going to love this."
Yeah. But I think since then, the funny thing is that when people see those of us who are public speakers, like myself and others who do this, whether preachers or evangelists or whatever, to go, sometimes they don't realise the fear that goes on behind the scenes. Every time, James, I get on a stage, whether it's like in 20 people at a Scout Hut or thousands of people at Keswick or wherever the Lord sends me, Speaker's Corner, or wherever, there is a massive part of my brain. It's like, Lord, why? Why can I not just sit in my study? Can I not walk the hills? I'm a hill walker. If I could pick anywhere to be, I'd be in the upper mountain somewhere with just me and the sheep and the eagles and whatever. That's my natural. I'm obviously my family, right? But to go, I love the outdoors, not being on a stage. But God continually I feel a sort of divine boot up the rear end, going, "Go on, get out there," and yet you'll say some stupid things, and yeah, you'll wish you'd done things differently, and yes, I know you'd rather not be there. But I know what's best for you. And that's the final thing as well. I think one of the big jokes for me in the gospel, is that we continually think we know what's good for us, whether it's the big meta shape of our lives, or even as Christians down to where we'd rather be. Bannister thinks the best place for him is on a hillside with just a view in front of him. But God's like, no, you funny wee man, you. To go, no, I created you. I know what's best for you. And this is the thing that's going to shape you the most into the kind of person that you're going to be, and it's going to help and bless and benefit the most others. And you may not see it, but I see it, and kind of thing. And I think that's actually quite funny when you think about it, because God's perspective is, of course, going to be better than ours. He's got the God's eye perspective. We just have the perspective of 60 years and 10 in my narrow little window. But still, I keep needing constant reminding that maybe his perspective possibly has more to shed on the subject than mine.
Yeah. And in the fine tradition of Moses, our instinct is always, "Oh Lord, send someone else."
Send somebody
but actually
else.
God
Exactly.
says, "No, I'm sending you," and and it might not be fun, but you'll be glad you did it. And even if you're not, you're doing it anyway.
I'm going to send you anyway, right? So
yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely. Well, you've really whetted our appetite for the book. Do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? And that can be bought at a variety of bookstores, both in person,
Absolutely,
when the law allows, but also on other on websites and things like that. We'll put a link to that in the show notes below. And also to my book, Gospel According to a Sitcom Writer, is also coming out in June. So, Andy Bannister, thanks very much.
James, it's been a pleasure as always.
Thank you very much. God bless. Bye-bye.